one of the things that I'm going to talk about is real brief, just how silly I think the GPA is. I'm pretty sure this would all just be preaching to the choir, so I'm not going to spend too much time on this. But to me, somewhere there was an intelligence agent who made his whole career finding out exactly who was going to attack exactly what, with exactly what weapon. And yet, here we have Homeland Security telling the entire country, threat level orange, watch out. Doesn't help you know if where you're at is a place that's in danger. Doesn't help you know what you should possibly do about it. And I think that is just about as helpful as the GPA. If you got, say, a 2.0 in calculus, but you're a biologist, you got 100% of everything you needed from biology out of that calculus class, all we know is threat level
That's
yellow.
an amusing concept.
Right. So, if you all have some of your own favorite pages from the book of GPA hate, I would love to hear anything that you dislike about the GPA. Feel free to just shout it out at me. Maybe it's a dislocation of the motivation for students from learning to just getting a good grade. Maybe it's just if you're stuck with an F, you don't feel like you can move up. Anybody, anything? Okay, never mind. We'll go to another picture here.
Do you really want to open it up to discussion? I'm happy.
Always. I mean, like, honestly,
I think one of the major challenges...
Wait a minute. Do you really want to open it up to discussion?
Yeah, it's going to help me focus a little bit later when we get to some other...
I think one of the there's several challenges, and you can argue about whether or not it's useful for formative assessment, the development of individuals, or summative to evaluate people and whatnot. And so that said, it's a stick, or a metric. And I would argue that it's not used for the things that it could be used for, but even so, it's treated as though it were objective. It's given numbers, for instance, with, I don't know how many decimal places we're up to, but in fact it's incredibly subjective. And so what counts as a 4.0 at Harvard is not the same as a 4.0 here. Much more difficult to get a 4.0 here, near as I can tell. I'll ask, Robert. So it's treated as though it's something that it in fact isn't. So in that sense, it's not even face valid, I guess would be.
Right? I mean, like in any one class, you've got a difference in what constitutes a grade, whether it was participation, or whether it was acing the tests. Just in one class, the grade means a different thing. Across classes, you get your curves thrown in there, and then this GPA starts disappearing, and at no time, like I've sat through 2 years of these talks here, these amazing talks here, and not once did anybody say, well, we wanted to find out what students were thinking, so we looked at their GPA. It just doesn't happen, right? What I have seen, though, is in some ways related to this sequence of images here. The development of one heck of an assessment, research-based, the development of a rubric and training teachers to use it, and then asking them to report it by the original colors of Lucky Charms rainbow. It just seems like we're losing a lot of information, and I sincerely believe that information is useful to us. But it's no small feat to try to keep track of not only every single question a student gets right or wrong, but further, if it's going to be any use at all, what facets of thinking those students are using when they're getting that question right or wrong. Because there's more than one right answer for many questions, just as there's more than one wrong answer. So, of course, we're going to need some pretty fancy databases to make this whole thing work. I'd like to just show, because in my mind I have my own idea for a database and database interface, but I'm not a computer programming guru. So I'd like to just start out by showing how many of the features of what I think is needed already exist in functional and broadly used technologies. So first with Pivot. Has anybody here used Pivot before? Check anything out? Have you heard of Pivot? This is it's a bit of software that's kind of an add-on to Silverlight and also an add-on to Microsoft Excel.
Pivot tables?
Pivot tables, yeah.
Good.
Yep. And in this case, pulling up a version that's supposed to help people track what's going on with different species that are going extinct. So the idea here is we've got a couple of thousand, probably can't read these numbers, it's 700, 600, 500. A couple of thousand little images here that all represent something about a particular species that's going extinct. I mean, I'm sure you can all imagine that there is a ton of information that you would need to track, and that just looking at a spreadsheet or just looking at a database isn't a whole lot of fun.
Can I ask a question? Because I was just, there's an NSF proposal out for cyber learning, and it has and there was a report from a bunch of computer science people who were talking about the deluge of information, and that we have to figure out how to teach people with respect to this deluge of information. And I was just curious whether people think that's like the biggest load of crap anybody's ever heard, or is meaningful. Because to me, that sort of trying to get a student to deal with this level of information is just, it seems to me absurd, because most of them can't do the basic stuff.
No, I agree. I mean, like,
Are you talking student or faculty?
Students,
So they want to
they were
teach.
talking. I mean, they were talking student. Like, oh, the genome is putting out terabytes of data all the time. Students have to be able to compare thousands of gene sequences, and it's like, why? I do that kind of work, and I don't compare thousands of gene sequences on a regular basis.
I think if anything, you just need to be able to sort and filter through stuff. I mean, when you look in, the fun part of the world, say YouTube, we're doing 2,000 hours of new YouTube video going up online all the time. If you do a search for research-based assessments in Google, you get 14 million hits. Like, you have to be able to go and pawn through tons and tons of data.
Or even on the student side, we collect tons. More importantly, I think we collect tons and tons of data on our students. And if we want to use that for evaluation, whether formative or summative, we need a better way to filter through this. What's the reason that we no longer have written assessments? Why did Santa Cruz do away with non-grading and their written assessments of grades?
Time and energy.
Because they're ambiguous too, right? But the other point would be
Well,
they're
hard to
ambiguous.
summarize. Hard to look at somebody's transcript. If you've got 80 pages of written assessment.
And Mike's right that they're ambiguous in the sense that it's hard to compare two people right
yeah.
next to each other if they're both great in different ways. But
Well,
that's okay.
It's a very common thing to get responses back that one answer to a problem has got 4 or 5 different contradictory statements in it. So it becomes a problem how to grade something like that, where people are contradicting themselves within an essay response. It becomes very difficult.
Right.
And that's what I mean by contradict.
I don't have a whole lot to say about essays, to be honest.
All right, well, we'll let you go to work.
All right.
We were just trying to fill in the technological gap.
Thank you. No, I do appreciate that. All right, so again, here we have a couple of thousand little pieces of data, which each themselves are fairly rich. In this case, it's color coded. You can pick different views and make it a little clearer to see a little bit about what's going on. Again, this is an endangered species interface. So I'm going to look in at birds. And again, now we just have way too much information, kind of hard to pull anything out of that. But with something, it's an ontologically structured database. It utilizes facets of information about each one of these points to sort and filter them. The first filter that I'm going to apply, I'm going to look only at the species that are currently considered to be vulnerable. So that shortens it down a little bit. But it's still okay, great. There's a bunch of little pictures. You can't see what they are. I'm going to jump in and check out their, what their population is doing, if the population is increasing or decreasing. All right? And so if you're just doing general research on populations of species that are going extinct, some patterns can jump out at you, such as pretty much all of the things that are going extinct or have made this red list, their populations are decreasing. Almost nobody's increasing. And this is the same across different
that would
species.
be what extinct means, isn't it?
Right. Or endangered. I think it's endangered.
You can be endangered, but of course, you can be endangered and
But
things can be turning around.
Right.
And,
But once
there's a lot of
they're
people spending a lot of
extinct,
money.
Precision versus acceleration, we're talking here.
Right. So anyway, Prezi, I'm not going to say that this would be the solution for education, but it's certainly one tool that you can use to really dive into an enormous set of data and start picking out patterns from it.
So with a tool like this, you enter all this information. You just enter everything you have, and then you're saying the program allows you to kind of re-bin things by what you want to look at?
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, I really appreciate you bringing that up, because there was another point I wanted to make here before I moved on. So this is a fun interface, right? I mean, you can zoom in, you can do all kinds of really cool stuff with this, right? But if you want to make one of these, you have to know how to do some pretty sweet programming. You know, you have to understand this language called CXML, or you can kind of get your way through it if you just use Excel. But again, this is fun. This is something that people would use, that would enjoy looking at it. If you want to make one, you have to know more computer programming language. And part of this database structure that I'm hoping will just somehow pop out of my imagination is based largely on being able to drag and drop a new element into this. And I don't want people to have to program to be able to use these things or build them. So that's one current limitation that I think exists for this particular software.
Can I make my last comment for today?
I don't believe
Which will be...
I don't think
We're going to hold you to that.
No, that's it. So the problem is, what does it mean? You know, you're binning all these things as if there's a distinct meaning to everything, right? So that it means something to be going extinct. So part of the issue is, how well defined is that issue? Now, when you're doing something like sequence homology in genes, you can be very quantifiable because it's a very boring, uninteresting metric. Well, because it's very easy, right? It's like one-dimensional. It's extremely easy to quantify. Now, if you want to tell me, well, how am I going to make a system that deals with grade point averages, which are not simple one-dimensional objects, right? I mean, what a grade a person gets in a class, if that's going to be a meaningful outcome, you know, that grade is influenced by so many things, right?
But isn't Ed saying that rather than looking at the GPA, for example, you can look at a whole collection of information and get a much better picture of the student's knowledge?
And let me play on that just a little bit further, which is, part of it is, I think what you're asking is, does the ontological structure already exist for a robust grading system? And maybe the point is it doesn't have to yet, which is that can be emergent from the structure and stuff that you fit into it, hopefully. I mean, the point is if you have a rich enough data set, then that itself, you're deciding to bin in certain different ways, can help emerge. So for instance, maybe grades should be based more on trajectories of students rather than fixed points of students. And maybe also you leave it to faculty to choose which are those categories. But for all of that, that's so much data processing that you need some help doing it. So that's what would be the hope for me, is that I take all the same crap that I collect now in my class, but I get help in organizing it so I get to see things a little bit differently.
You're going to input like essay-type materials, or you're going to normalize with respect to the authenticity of the grading scheme used, or...
Well, you can look at different subjects. You say, how did they do on E&M in the beginning of the year? How did they do in tests versus homework versus... I mean, you can think of a lot of different ways to bin in that thing.
Right.
You know, especially if you've got a biology student taking physics, you talk about, like, well, what do they need to know? You could look at, okay, these are the topics I'm interested in. How do they do in those? Throw the rest out. You know, but right now you just get the grade. You can't see that information. But I could give you their little file, and you could see for yourself.
So that brings up the question of who's using these grades, right? I mean, the students might, for themselves, want to know, what can I do to improve? We could use it within your department. You could use it across CU. But then as soon as it goes outside of an institution, say to an employer or somebody who's going to be judging a student for an internship, again, you have to somehow boil it down into something that they can use, and especially to compare with systems that are still the standard GPA systems.
And I would say in all points, so, I mean, the end goal for this is not to be able to track really clearly who got an A or a B, or to be able to break it down and say this person got an A or B in these 3 classes. I mean, I remember one of the first talks I got to see here was a gentleman up from Texas, and they spent mega millions on this software that was able to utilize divergence theorem and all this neat stuff to show that students who started with an A generally kept an A throughout the whole thing. Students who started with a B generally kept it. That's useless information. I mean, that at least it's useless in helping students make any forward steps, or in explaining to employers or following teachers or their parents or themselves what it is that they need work on. So my end goal is not to have a system that does a really good job at tracking grades. My end goal, which will be coming up here in a couple of slides, so to speak, is to be able to condense all of this rich information that's coming out of all the assessments, et cetera, that you're making into formats that are more meaningful than just a letter grade. Of these other database interfaces, the only other one I want to look at right now, since we're getting lots of good conversation going, is this one called the Ontology Online. And this is an example of a biological ontology, which again, if you're not super familiar with ontologies, I'd say just think of it as hierarchies, ways of thinking, and whether or not something exists at the union of two outlines. So what this particular ontological search engine allows you to do is interact with a hierarchical description of different elements that are within the database. So if you wanted to learn something about biological adhesion, okay, normally you would click on here and something would happen. There we go. Now by choosing not necessarily a keyword, but more of a broad topical area, you can then look through this database and find images that are related to biological adhesion, books that are related to biological adhesion. On this side, this is something that I think most people are familiar with. You understand how to use an outline. You know how to use nested outlines. So I think that you can pawn through, again, an enormous database of everything from pictures to blog entries to books by just knowing how to use an outline. Again, in this case, we're not able to drag and drop and add to this thing. If you want to look at this RDFA embedded OWL web ontology language, it takes a while to have any clue what's going on with that at all. So, with this in mind, just please understand that it's entirely possible to access a database with just an outline. Any general questions about that?
No, but this actually does play more to Mike's question, too, or the challenge of Mike's question, which is you have to know what those ontological structures, those knowledge structures are in advance to be able to sort and bin and filter things along those.
Yeah, I think and we're really creeping up on where this is all going to start coming together, but I sincerely believe that you can lay out a structure similar to what's already been agreed upon, say with standards, or with what's already chosen in a course or in books. Like you open a physics book, there's only so many chapters. There's only so many titles of chapters. You could open up 100 different physics books, and pretty much, if it's all intro level, they're all going to be like, we need you to learn Newton's laws, right? And so the emergent stuff that comes in later is what you see when you're focusing in on what's either already agreed upon or what the system can allow you to agree upon as what we should care about for what students should learn.
Just out of curiosity then, I mean, are the ontological structures then that you're drawing from and are going to frame are built on the structures of the disciplines themselves? What it is that students are trying to learn?
I mean, like, to hack this whole system into the existing education system, I need to work with...
Right, okay. I was just trying to think, I mean, because you could imagine other ways of looking at it, like, what is it... Well, if you wanted to go crazy, you'd say, what is it that students know, or what is it that they got out, which may not fall along those lines, maybe it would. But you could also imagine breaking it down by types of student work and skill sets the students have and how they demonstrate on what they do, which is essays versus homework versus other kinds of things. But maybe this will all come through, too.
I think so. I think you're doing some great foreshadowing for me.